Thank you everyone for coming out today. So obviously we're all here because many of us, if not all of us, are people of religious faith, and we understand how central our religious commitments are to every aspect of our life. It determines what we think, why we exist, how we should live our lives, and also impacts on our understanding that our conduct has eternal consequences for ourselves. And it's that realization that lets us understand that it's the most central, most important aspect of our life. Can people at the back hear me, or you can? All right, that's good. But despite that importance of religious liberty, we have a government in Australia that is no longer committed to religious liberty. So as Asha said, there are many, many threats now to religious liberty in Australia.
Is this working? Oh, it's great. So there are many, many threats to religious liberty in Australia. Asha talked about some of them. I'll just go quickly through some of them as well. So religious schools, religious universities, is a profound threat in Australia to religious education. As Asha mentioned, last December, the Sex Discrimination Act at the Commonwealth level was almost amended, and if that had passed, it would have profoundly undermined the ability of religious schools, religious tertiary institutions, religious organisations, including those operating at churches, at mosques, at temples, at a range of different religious organisations, to teach their religious belief. It would have prohibited any statement that could be understood as imposing a detriment on the grounds of marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity and other grounds. It was an extraordinary broad prohibition that was going to be imposed on religious organisations, and it would have had a profoundly negative impact on the ability of our religious organisations to operate. That almost came about, and it's going to come back before the Commonwealth Parliament in May, June, in the next Parliament. Once the Commonwealth Parliament moves, the New South Wales Parliament will move as well. So that's the religious schools, religious education is a huge problem. We also have problems with parental rights. There is a move to undermine the ability of parents to control or to supervise what their children are learning at schools, to remove them from inappropriate classes, and also to look after them and to raise them in a way that they consider to be appropriate. We see this primarily in the transgender issue, that if your child begins to identify as the opposite sex, your ability to try and help them affirm their biological sex will be undermined, and if you try to do that, the move is becoming that it will be a type of child abuse for you. So there's an enormous threat to the rights of parents in what's happening here. We also have problems with the government. The government is turning against religious liberty. They're going to start putting conditions on government funding, the use of government resources, charitable status, that unless you have politically correct views on things like gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, these other grounds, you will lose government support, and government will increasingly begin to attack you in its laws and policies. We have problems with vilification laws, which are essentially blasphemy laws that will be used to attack particular religious groups when they present their religious views. We have a range of other problems as well that are coming in terms of discrimination law. We know many examples, and you personally from your own school, from your own families and friends, you would know examples of people who have been discriminated against because they're traditional Christians, because they're Muslims, because they're Hindu, a range of different religions. You would know in employment situations, in organisations, in a range of other circumstances, individuals have been harmed, have been discriminated against because of their religious beliefs. And we also have concerns with conscientious protection. As Asha mentioned, same-sex marriage came into force a year and a half ago, and there was insufficient protection in that act for those who had a conscientious objection to facilitating same-sex marriage. The government, Labor, Liberal, National Greens, was in a rush to introduce those laws to please segments of the community, and as a consequence they threw religious liberty under the bus by introducing these laws that no one thought they'd introduce. They provided inadequate protection to religious liberty, but nevertheless they did it, and they went ahead with a bill that no one thought was going to be introduced. So there are only some of the enormous threats that we face to religious liberty. And so what kind of legal protection exists in Australia for religious liberty? It's very, very limited. In the Commonwealth Constitution under Section 116, there is a protection for religious liberty, a prohibition on the government enacting laws that will prohibit the free exercise of any religion, that will establish any religion. But the High Court has interpreted this section in a purposive way So a law will only be invalid if the purpose of Commonwealth Parliament was to limit religious freedom. And that's never, very rarely if ever, is going to be the approach the Commonwealth Parliament will take. Some benefit to doing that, but we should be very sceptical of any measure that gives the role of defending religious liberty to tribunals or courts. These bodies are typically staffed with individuals who have a Greens worldview, who are going to interpret any ambiguity in a way that's hostile to religious liberty. They'll typically set it up as an equality versus religious liberty clash, and they'll say equality should triumph religious liberty in almost every circumstance. That's how they typically approach these issues, and it's flawed because equality is a right. If you look at the international human rights instruments, it's a right that also protects religion. So there may be some benefit in adding religion to the grounds of discrimination law, but it's not going to be adequate enough in itself. Some people are going to say what we need is a Charter of Rights. So Queensland has just introduced one, the ACT has one, Victoria has one, but we should be very, very sceptical of this because again, it'll have all these general principles and then it will go to a court or a tribunal to decide what kind of protection should be provided. And the kind of people, as I've said, in these courts and tribunals are not supportive of religious liberty. So we should be very, very sceptical of a Charter of Rights, of a Bill of Rights, of a Human Rights Act, because the experience overseas, the experience in Australia shows it does not help religious liberty. It does not help the kind of concerns that we have. The solution we need is for the Parliament to introduce detailed legislation on specific issues that arise in various areas throughout society. So the marriage issue is the exact kind of case I was talking about. That was the opportunity for the Commonwealth Parliament to work out what the religious liberty threats were by amending the Marriage Act to make it a two-person institution. And there they should have introduced detailed provisions to provide protection to individuals. So florists, photographers, bakers were not required to use their artistic services to provide goods to a same-sex marriage or another kind of marriage they disagreed with. That people who were celebrating marriage, civil celebrants, weren't required to do it. That's when they should have done it. They should have taken a very detailed approach. And for all of the concerns we have, that's the approach we should be advocating for. Parliament should be focusing on a particular area and taking a detailed approach in terms of what the law is. But in order for us to be confident that the Commonwealth and the state parliaments are going to take this approach, it's critical that we actually have good parliamentarians at the state and the Commonwealth level. And at the moment we clearly don't. Labor, Liberal, Nationals, Greens, all four of those parties have abandoned religious liberty. They no longer care about it. It's particularly disgraceful for the Liberal Party because in their foundational documents they talk about how they value freedom of religion and freedom of speech, but they clearly don't value it anymore. So we have to abandon them. As I mentioned, I'm a candidate for the Australian Conservatives, and I obviously recommend this party for you. And you look at the people we have as the candidates. We have Lyle Shelton, Sophie York. You remember she was one of the prominent individuals in the marriage campaign, trying to ensure that marriage wasn't redefined. So supporting us would be a good proposition. Mark Latham has obviously been someone who's been very active in promoting religious liberty and ensuring that the government doesn't introduce any laws that are hostile to us. So supporting Mark and so other people like us. It's critical that we vote for people who are going to introduce the kind of laws that we need to protect religious liberty, and that's crucial. But I want to say one more important thing. The legal issue is critical, but it's far more important that we start engaging with the culture, because that's where the fight is. The reason why all this change has happened that's adverse to us is because our culture no longer respects religious liberty. Millions of Australians consider religion no longer to be a social good, but something that's actually harmful, and we would be better off as a country if religion was privatised, and ideally people were all atheists. And to a degree, we can understand why many of them have reached that conclusion. We have problems with religiously inspired violence. We have problems with religious leaders engaging in child sex abuse. We have a range of other problems where religious leaders and religious adherents have let themselves and their religion down by not actually setting a good example. And so that's why it's up for all of us here who are obviously concerned about religious liberty to recognise it's up to us as individuals to set a good example for our religion and to engage with others and trying to help them to understand that the religion is a force for good, that religious liberty should be protected because it allows us to be better human beings and to create a better society. But that's the kind of thing we need to do on an individual conversation by conversation basis. So the political issue is incredibly important, that we do our best to vote in quality people, but it's far more important that we start engaging with culture and the individual conversations we have, and that's far more important, but both are critical. So that's all I wanted to say. I'm happy to take questions afterwards, but I'll pass you back now to Con.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg. And, again, thank you to everybody for bearing with us through the ups and downs of this rally.